Okay, cool. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you for opening the screening, Nika. This is our second program. Inbar and I are, you can wave, are programming a series of cinema events. So this is our second one. This is the Horror of Hereness. Before we begin, I want to say thank you to the Studio for Creative Inquiry for supporting our programming and for hosting tonight's event. The 16mm projections for this program were made possible by a Steiner Visitor Invitation grant. Thank you to the Filmmakers Co-op in New York for providing the print, and thank you to Flea Market Films, aka Stephen Haynes, for bringing your projecting skills to the table tonight and for being a supportive sounding board for our programming. I love this. So tonight's event was formed through a series of encounters and conversations with archivists, cinephiles, and filmmakers. Hollis Frampton's film, Winter Solstice, was first brought to our attention by archivist Emily Davis. In relaying information about Pittsburgh's legacy as a center for avant-garde cinema, Frampton's film came into discussion. Frampton shot Winter Solstice at U.S. Steel's Homestead Works in 1974. The film's production was facilitated by Sally Dixon, a known supporter of experimental cinema and, at the time, the film curator at the Carnegie Museum of Art. Winter Solstice is one of 3 films that comprise Frampton's, and you'll have to excuse me, we couldn't find the pronunciation, Solarium Magellani trilogy, which is completed by Summer Solstice and Autumnal Equinox. Filmed in a steel mill, a pasture, and a slaughterhouse, respectively, each of these works examine spaces of transformation and production, cycles of life and death, destruction, and rebirth. The winter solstice itself is, of course, the darkest day of the year. It's the longest night, the day that marks a symbolic death and rebirth of the sun, which gradually begins to brighten the days for longer durations once the solstice has passed. Frampton's work made me feel compelled by what was on the screen, but also curious about what was occurring just beyond his frames. So for that reason, tonight's screening seeks to situate Frampton's work within Pittsburgh's industrial history and to examine the questionable intersections of horror and documentary in Pittsburgh-made cinema from the 1970s through the 90s. This screening will be followed by a conversation between myself and Dr. Adam Lowenstein, who is a professor of film and media studies at University of Pittsburgh and the leader of the Horror Studies Working Group. Adam's recent book, which is sitting over there, Horror, Film, and Otherness, brings instability to the notion of otherness and monstrosity and will provide buttressing for the conversation as we look at clips from Ray Henderson and Tony Buba's 1996 documentary, Struggles in Steel, The Fight for Equal Opportunity, a work that brings voice to the history of Black steelworkers in Pittsburgh and beyond, and George A. Romero's 1978 film, Martin, a postmodern vampire tale set in Braddock, Pennsylvania. So without further ado, thank you to Adam, to Flea Market Films, Emily Davis, and Tony Buba for their advising, support, and participation. Thank you to everyone at the studio. That's Nika, Harrison, Bill, Linda, Olivia, for helping bring this to life. So yeah, we hope you enjoy the program. Cool, thank you for witnessing that work with us. And I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of framing to the discussion before I invite Adam up to join me. So I became fascinated by Frampton's Winter Solstice, super entranced by its mesmerizing and unnerving images and rhythms. The experimental work, very much rooted in structuralism and abstraction, reveals and I feel revels in the violence and beauty of the steelmaking process, and yet we see very few workers, no surrounding landscape or context. And so it was difficult for me to remove Frampton's film from the context that I felt hyper aware of. It was shot at Homestead Steelworks, the site of the 1892 steel strike, orchestrated in response to Andrew Carnegie's union busting, which we're now sitting in this building, so I feel like the revival of this film feels worthy here. The site holds both a history of devastating violence and incredible importance for the history of U.S. labor movements. Frampton's film, shot in '74, was created during the decline of the steel industry here. And while the violence of material transformation unfolds before Frampton's camera, a violent transformation was also occurring in the city, or beginning to occur. And so I wanted to bring context to Frampton's work as a way of assessing the seepage, sort of, between horror and the avant-garde and documentary genres. These questions were fueled by a reading of Adam's book, Horror, Film, and Otherness, which I'll just hold up for everyone since it's here. And my own research at the moment on Pittsburgh's film history led me to a deep dive on the work of George Romero, which effectively led me to Adam, whose book opened with festering questions after the horrific Tree of Life attack. So Lowenstein opens the book asking, what happens when horror comes home? When horror is no longer something out there, something alien, something other, but something intimate. When horror seeps into the everyday and ordinary rather than being bound solely to the fantastical and ordinary. While I feel these questions can be heartily unpacked in an analysis of the many horror films shot here in Pittsburgh, from zombies to vampires, I was hoping that this program could examine the ways that this sort of energy maybe appears in this work, and how the horror genre works to engage with Pittsburgh's industrial history and to reveal the horrors of reality itself. So I'll invite Adam up and do a formal introduction in the hope that we can collectively connect and further unravel some of these threads. So I'm hoping this discussion can be a thought experiment for us all, not just Adam and I in conversation. If you have something to offer, I really urge you to bring it into the room. So Adam, if you'll join me. Dr. Adam Lowenstein is a professor of English and Film Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He works on issues relating to the cinema as a mode of historical, cultural, and aesthetic confrontation. His teaching and research link these issues to the relays between genre films and art films, cinema and digital media, the politics of spectatorship, and the construction of national cinemas. He's the author of Shocking Representation, Historical Trauma, National Cinema, and the Modern Horror Film, and Dreaming of Cinema, Spectatorship, Surrealism, and the Age of Digital Media, and most recently, Horror, Film, and Otherness, all published by Columbia University Press. Dr. Lowenstein's work is especially invested in horror studies. He's the director of Pitt's Horror Studies Working Group, which you could find at horrormatters.org, as well as a board member of the George A. Romero Foundation. So thanks, Adam, for being here to chat with me.
Thank you for having me
today.
Thank you all for coming.
I guess I'm always conflicted by this film because it is so visually stunning and yet depicting such a violent sort of cyclical process, and seems to be self-aware in calling itself, or Frampton calling it, right, winter solstice, the idea of the darkest day before the light comes again. And so I guess just opening up that conversation is I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts after seeing the film projected. What are your immediate inclinations towards I feel moments of horror, but also moments of reverie?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant and powerful film, and what I found myself noticing this time around watching it, and thanks so much to Stephen for allowing us to watch it in this way, is, you mentioned winter solstice as basically the long dark night, right? But this film feels so hot. You can almost feel the heat coming off the screen, and there's something dazzling about that, as well as hellish too. So it's interesting that I think for most of us, winter solstice sort of the term connotes sort of cold, dark, sort of void. But what we get are these images that are hot and really quite full of light and life, and not to say that there aren't dimensions to that are unsettling in some kind of way, but that's just what struck me very much this time around is the sort of the tension between the title and the images.
Yeah, I found myself thinking a lot about, I guess there's also in a like contemporary context, this sort of like horror of being forced to engage with these images for a long duration. And then I kind of like start to think of this, I mean, to be a laborer witnessing this sort of like every day, you kind of like are put in that position, but then you're not, because you're removed and can take pleasure in the sort of like celestial landscape environment that Frampton is creating. And I guess like something that I feel curious about with this film is a term you bring up in your book in relationship to Martin, actually, which we'll screen a clip of and talk about in a few minutes. But like this idea, and it's something that's troubling to me and maybe others in the room who work with cameras, like vampire documentarian is what you call the Martin character in the book. And I'm curious if you could like maybe unpack that, and maybe not in relation to the movie, but that term.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as we'll get to see, I guess, a little bit of, and maybe talk a little bit more about in a bit, is, you know, George Romero's film Martin, which isn't as well known in general as his Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, is to my mind Romero's finest film, and one of the reasons I think it's his finest film is that all of his work really incorporates these two impulses, you know, the fantastic, you know, with the monsters and the horror and the world of the fantastic, but then also all the films demonstrate a keen interest in documentation, and George, you know, got a lot of energy out of being in Pittsburgh, and you know, knew these surroundings very well, and you can feel that in Martin very powerfully, and so, you know, Martin to me feels like the film of his that balances these two elements sort of most intriguingly and challengingly, and that's why I call Martin, who's the main character of the film, who is a vampire, kind of. I mean, he doesn't have fangs; he has razor blades instead of fangs. He can't, you know, bewitch his victims with a vampiric stare, so he drugs them. So he's not a supernatural vampire, but he's a working vampire, and he comes to Braddock, and he you know, commits vampiric violence, but he's also working at least as hard on observing his surroundings. And Martin is really our guide into the world of Braddock in the late 70s. And he is our vampire, but he's also our documentarian. And another thing I was thinking of, to loop it back to Winter Solstice, is another film, if we had all night, and probably maybe, you know, multiple nights, that we could show interestingly in this program, would be The Deer Hunter, which is also set in Western Pennsylvania, also has crucial scenes in steel mills, but Winter Solstice is sort of, and Martin as well, but since we just saw Winter Solstice, you know, The Deer Hunter is so invested in a confident realism. You know, there's this whole idea that what The Deer Hunter is showing us is, you know, this is what a steel mill is really like, and this is what it's really like to be a steel worker, and this is what it's really like to go to Vietnam, and this is what it's really like to come back. And it's so confident that it can capture all of those things that we as viewers are really left off the hook in many ways. You know, we're just seeing what really is. And if you take those steel mill scenes in The Deer Hunter and put them up against Winter Solstice, you see that what Frampton is going for is something very, very different, and I think something that forces us into a space where we can't do that kind of assuming. You know, like I know what a steel mill is like. I know what being a steel worker is like. I know what a Rust Belt town is like. I know what economic collapse is like. You know, I think what Frampton invites us to do and what Romero invites us to do is to question those sorts of assumptions.
Yeah, I agree. And I find that I'm faced with like a very similar question as a viewer, and just like because my practice involves a camera, where I struggle with Frampton's role in the film as someone from outside coming in and making this film that shows a sense of horror, but also a sense of like industrial fetishism that I think is like potentially a harmful way of contextualizing that history. But then I also agree he's not, by not giving the context, he gets himself off the hook of that, but then in a sense, but then knowing the context, it's hard not to, for me, and why we're sitting here, like keep putting it back in this place of like, but you're here and you're documenting this kind of like glorified thing as it's having a real impact on the lives of the people around you. And I guess that role of vampire documentarian stands out to me, because I don't think that what Frampton's trying to do is make a documentary about steel making, but he's like taking from this thing and making a document of sorts, which is magical, and changes the content. It like becomes its own magical entity, but it is transformed by his camera. And I guess like it would be, unless anyone first, like if anyone wants to kind of comment or say anything, put anything into the room, I want to offer space for that. And if not, maybe we could watch the opening of Martin.
Along with what you're both are saying, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
I'm going to repeat your question.
Yes, with what you're all saying already, this film reminded me of a couple of avant-garde films. One, more obviously, I think, being Joseph Cornell's By Night, Torch and Spear, which is also imagery of a steel mill, but is one that is found footage, and it's very recognizable, and he makes it unfamiliar, but in a way that's kind of beautiful. Whereas this, does come off, as I agree, more horrific and violent. But my question is partly, is some of that the degree to which Frampton is able to abstract things that are familiar and recognizable? Like, is that abstraction a part of that sort of violent or horrific or process, or one that leads more towards these feelings?
I think that's for you.
Okay, so repeating the question essentially is, does the abstraction aid or relieve the violence that Frampton is depicting? I think it does. For me, it does both. I think like the abstraction, I think I'm curious to know how people would see the film had I not opened this program and said what I said. It makes you view it through a specific lens, but also I think without that lens, maybe that's the violence I fear, is that it becomes a kind of like document of the pleasurable viewing. So I think it's like a double-edged sword. Like the abstraction saves us as an audience from confronting the reality, in a sense.
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking of to add to that mix is I wonder what you think about the role of repetition is in the film. Like it's not as if the beauty of the images is separate from a sense of repetition and almost if we want to sort of tie it more closely to like rhythms of work rather than artistic sort of contemplation, I think there's ways to do that, and I certainly felt that in the film. But I'm curious what you felt along the lines of what repetition might be doing in all of this.
I mean, I think that that's very true, and I think that the editing structure is the one structure that I feel like maybe places us as the audience in the position of maybe a worker or a laborer who witnesses something that is quote unquote spectacular to an outsider, but maybe mundane to someone who deals with it every day. However, I also think, like, going back to the Winter Solstice title, I think that cycle, that endless cycle, has to do with like this day, this long kind of like repeated cycle that he's gesturing towards as well, which also speaks to kind of like the horror, and I mean, this is very subjective, but like the horror of existing in a society where people must labor, like the horror of waking up every day and kind of like falling into these rhythms. But I think that the infliction on the audience is one of like, you are kind of put into a contract where you must, if you stay, right, like engage with that.
Yeah, I mean, for me also, something that's going on with the repetition, you captured it very eloquently in terms of, the routines of a hard work day. But because the film is also so hot in the way that I was describing, I mean, you never forget the danger of what's being done here. I mean, things are being made. You get that clearly, but because it's all clearly so burning hot, you always, at least for me, there's always the sense of like, well, maybe the reason we don't see many people in these images is that it's actually very dangerous to get as close to these images as the camera is getting. So I feel that in the film too.
I like almost don't want to push this the other way, but then I also feel it suggests something about Frampton's camera, which is that he is far away, and only close by proximity of his lens. Which is I think like he doesn't have to get as close maybe, which again is a tension that I think like makes this film so interesting in its context. But I do agree with you, like we see silhouettes of bodies maybe once or twice, and they're totally obscured.
Yeah, clearly a decision to not foreground those people.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could continue to tease out. I'm interested when you're talking about being the cinematographer and the lens, but also the body of the person making it. And certainly he's got the telephoto lens, but there's also this very palpable sense of body and absence of weight, given what we know about the images, and yet we see them suspended. And I just wonder if you could tease that out a little more.
Okay, so you're thinking, I like this question. You're thinking about, so what is the relationship essentially of like the filmmaker to the physical material?
Right.
And
then I guess yourself as audience.
And yourself as audience. I mean, I think like the telephoto does something interesting in that, I mean, I'm reading it as a telephoto. I'm reading the shakiness as I'm far away and I'm trying to get these kinds of like abstract landscapey images out of something that I actually can't get close enough to. But I also think that like being able to view something through a lens kind of like removes you from the danger in a sense. Like he's there, but also protected by the fact that he's like, whenever you go anywhere that as a filmmaker, you're like kind of protected by the fact that you're the filmmaker showing up with the camera. And I believe that gives you a sense of power or authority over like what is kind of how you engage, unfortunately. But yeah, I'm not sure I could like answer that question, but I am thinking about, I'm rolling it over in my mind. What do you think?
I would be a little, I don't know, I haven't read about it, but I, from seeing the film again, feel that there is greater jeopardy for the filmmaker and less control than you might be ascribing. I feel as though it's probably in-camera edited, and over a prolonged period of time where he is in an unfamiliar environment and witnessing this miracle that's going on. But I imagine him as palpably there as I do the other bodies that we see throughout. So yeah, the heat that Adam's talking about is just so present.
Yeah. Do you want to respond? Or Ben?
You guys keep talking about like the heat of it and like the context behind it being this like super hot thing that's going on, while there's kind of the context of it being, you know, the winter solstice, it's cold outside, whatever. I keep coming back to this idea of the horror trope of surviving the winter and surviving the cold, and how it's like we keep seeing these repeat images of heat and these repeat images of making things that are hot, almost as if it's kind of like this necessity in order to keep the thing alive, but you're also abstracting it so much by taking all the people out. So why is survival necessary? You just have this mechanical process that seems to have all of the themes of why we want it to be there and be scary, but we have no human interaction. So like, why does it exist? Like, why do all of those things still need to be there? It's not really the question. It's just that
No, I think that's a really fascinating observation, and you know, it always strikes me when I see this film that, along with all of the striking presence of the things that you guys have been talking about, there's also these striking absences too, and you know, one is the workers, but another is any sense of linear process. Like, there's no sense of like, okay, we start with this, and then we go to step 2, and then we go to step 3, and then voila, you've got a steel beam, and like, look how amazing that is. You know, it's not a film that sort of dwells in the process as instrumentalized, right? There's not a sense of like, well, we do this work to get this done, and here is the product, and so what it's not linear, and there's the sense like you were evoking of well, what is it all for, really? And if there's that much effort and that much heat and that much danger involved, like, what is it responding to? What is it sort of filling the void of?
I guess that I could. Oh, Kim, do you want to? Oh, I guess the thing that just comes up for me is this notion of like industry and progress, and like this actually like unachievable, utopic maybe like state of being like the most powerful or the most productive, or like, which is a very American idea and value, I believe, or at least like in the context of this film, I see it as like the kind of like, there will be another winter solstice, right? There will be another dark day, and I think that kind of like the no result thing of it is actually really important to the idea of like a loomingness, perhaps, or like this forced this kind of like constant transformation that maybe one must undergo as time progresses, like one or a material or a place or something like that.
Kim, yeah.
I just wanted to add that the repetition, I felt, really serves to take me outside of that sublime dissolving of self that a film structure normally would do. It becomes boring, you know, and it's beautiful. It's extraordinary. I was thinking we should all be making films, obviously, and then I became really bored, and it's the way that's interesting. It's going to make distancing to me. So I just, yeah, that was something you brought up, repetition of work, but I think also just the boringness of it, and the sublime. Those were the two things that I was really.
I think we'll go to Paul really quickly and then move on to the next clip because I don't want to become a repetition. Paul.
I was basically, Kim actually said most of what I wanted to say better than I would have said. But I was kind of like going to respond to what Andrew was talking about, sort of like Hollis Frampton's role in like sort of like his presence of his body, just sort of like uncomfortable in this factory all day, filming all of these like hot scenarios in a place that was probably still pretty hot. And also your experience of it, where it was this situation of like the first 15 minutes was like, this is really beautiful. And then with the repetition, it's like, oh, this is just very boring. And by the end of the film, I was feeling like very like, not uncomfortable in the sense of like a mental like harm from a book, but almost like a physical, I'm in a stuffy room for way too long, in a sense where I was like about to doze off, not from like boredom, but physical discomfort. And I think what this film really captured for me was, again, just the feeling that Hollis was probably feeling in that place where the initial sublimity and beauty of all this noise and all this activity, all this creation going around him just kind of turns into this big slog where, as we were saying, kind of like, what is it for? The idea of like, this is to produce steel, just kind of dissolve into all the sparks, all the molten metal flying around, and it's just this big thing you're stuck in, like a long winter night, except at least a long winter night is cold. Yeah. I mean that in a good way, like.
Okay. Charlie, were you gesturing at me?
I was just going to add that I think that, first of all, it's great to have this here. I think of it as painterly. I think this is someone who's aware of Frederick Wiseman at the exact same time. Very obviously not linear because Wiseman's going to look at things linearly and walk you through any space or anything like a lawyer might. This is a lawyer and he's going to look like a lawyer. And this is painting and this is like a complex thing to photograph because of the lighting. And I don't know, I wonder when I hear us how far away we are from what it was to actually be in this time and be able to go into a theater and not see a movie. And how profound it was to be in a theater and not see a movie. And then to not be in a movie, to have that be underscored as not a movie. And the thing that we call boring, they probably at that moment could see as liberating.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. And I would just add quickly that, you know, if we think about what's going on in avant-garde film at this time, I mean, I would actually posit Winter Solstice as an action-packed blockbuster adventure film compared to lots of sort of structural film that really, you know, is questing for the boring, right? I mean, I actually think this film is, to me, is not boring at all.
Just thinking of the notion of saying repetition at a time also when flicker films are happening, where it's like the repetition is the body and the form in its entirety.
Exactly.
We could have shown Lemon. Okay. Sorry. So we're going to move on to Martin really quickly just to kind of buttress this with like a little bit of other filmmaking that's happening pretty close by, intertwined. So yeah, this is kind of one of the first opening scenes from Martin that Adam focuses on in the book. So yeah. Okay, so that's just like the opening scene of Martin, where Martin arrives to his new home in Braddock. And I guess I chose to play that clip because I'm interested in how you fixate on place as core to Martin and as core to like the characterization of the film. So yeah, why do you go so in depth about? Can you talk about like why unpacking this scene is so important to, your analysis of the film?
Yeah, I'll try. The first thing I should say is that this is actually not the opening of Martin.
Right.
And it's really important to remember that the way the film actually starts is with a horrific killing that Martin performs. So Martin starts out as being an object for us of real terror. He breaks into a woman's car on the train to Pittsburgh and murders her vampirically. So what we're watching in this second scene in the film is actually the flipping of that completely. And now Martin, who's the unassuming guy sort of clumsily following along the imposing Kuda, who's his older cousin, who's taking him in Braddock, but you can see Kuda believes he's a vampire. You know, he crosses himself and he can't bring himself to even speak to him. Martin here is very vulnerable, and he's being led along like a child. He like barely makes the train, and in case you're confused, you know, this was back in time when you could actually take a commuter train from the downtown train station to Braddock. We don't have that anymore. But that's what's happening in the scene. You know, Martin's arrived on the Amtrak downtown, and now he has to switch to a commuter train to get to Braddock. And so, like, I think one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by the scene that you just showed us is that part of it is we're experiencing this transformation in our viewing position where we've gone from, wow, Martin is someone we really need to be afraid of, and he's clearly the monster in this movie, to like, wait a second, this guy is nothing in this cavernous, strange place that is Pittsburgh and then Braddock, and he's the closest thing we have to a tour guide, because he's like us. You know, he's entering these strange places, and so we have to follow him. And so I think the film sets up immediately a way for us to experience Pittsburgh and experience Braddock through a very different sort of lens than if, say, the film just began in this way. And I think we would again be in a position that's much more comfortable, right? But the fact that we're sort of being led along by our object of terror in a place where he clearly feels quite terrified is a really interesting way to enter the world of Pittsburgh and Braddock, and I think the film just goes on from this point to sort of weave more and more complex layers about not only what is this place we call Pittsburgh and Braddock, and the film actually does a lot of work to remind us that these are actually two different places rather than the same place. But you know, we're on this sort of trajectory where we can't ever really rest, with the idea of like, oh, I know what Pittsburgh is, I know what Braddock is, or I know what these kinds of places are, and it doesn't preach to us, right? I mean, we don't get images that we're not looking at like a closed down steel mill, right? But what we get is the trash compacting junkyard as the sort of, the most active, noisy place. Again, no workers to be seen, very few people on the streets, dogs running alone. It's the middle of the day and there's like nothing happening. And you immediately feel what is happening in Braddock at that time, which is that brutal depopulation. I mean, that's what's really going on, is that sense of there used to be people here and that there's not.
Yeah, and I think that something that's really powerful in that opening sequence is you see him sort of like dwarfed by the city, and then once he goes into Braddock, he's no longer dwarfed, but has this look of being dwarfed, or just like this kind of smallness and innocence suddenly. And I guess I start to think about like something that's very forward in this film for me after reading the chapter in your book about it, is that there's this sort of like meta vampirization going on, that this is like a place in the world that has been vampirized by a system of capital, and then like kind of left like one of Martin's victims. But again, I don't think like Romero leaves it that simple to say that like now this thing is like deceased. I think that there's a hopefulness in that like what is unknown or terrifying in that moment could become something you don't expect, or there's a sense of possible rejuvenation or reanimation or renewal that actually I find not the antithesis of the horror.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most fascinating things that Romero seems to posit in this film is that the vampire is actually not here to vampirize the community. The community's already been vampirized. And Martin is actually the new blood that's coming into town to build something. I mean, unlike almost every other character in the film, he actually stays in Braddock when everyone else is either making plans to leave or actually leaves. So as the film goes on, you sort of, you switch from this position of Martin is the problem to something closer to like, Martin might be something closer to the solution to this. And what does that mean for a vampire to be the solution is a pretty dire place to be. But there's real hope in Martin, actually. I mean, it's contingent, and I don't want to give things away for people who haven't seen the film, but there is a hard-earned glimmer of hope, I think.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with the fact of like how place becomes a character, and how there is, and how that is a character in all of Romero's films, and this refusal of erasure, which I kind of want to use as a way to go into Tony and Ray Henderson's film, which is that like something that I fear about the Frampton film is this act of possible erasure. And so I thought that it would be fitting, also because this film was shot in Tony Buba's mother's house. And just knowing that, right, these people are working closely together, and there is a conversation happening between people working in the avant-garde, making narrative horror films, and we had talked about this, and working in documentary and working on each other's stuff. And so I think like while Martin gestures toward the horror of reality, the horror of a community that is vampirized, a horror of like really devastating kind of loss, I feel that the clip from Tony and Ray's film addresses the horror of systemic erasure, and attempts to, again, like bring a rejuvenation to this history. And so I just wanted to pull it out as kind of like a theme that I'm seeing, is that like the horror, I felt like weird calling this the horror of Hereness, because like I think like it's not totally a horror. There's like always this flip side, and I think that that's what you're your book does wonderfully, which is that like the idea of horror as otherness. What about the horror in you, and when the monster in you, and when you can not alienate from that horror but accept it as like a condition of being, how that can transform your interaction with selfhood and others. So yeah, if you want to say anything.
No, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean the term that I sort of use in the book to sort of capture this is transformative otherness, and the idea behind it is that so many accounts of the horror film really sort of dwell in the idea that, well, there's a monster and then there's normality, and the drama in the film is about the monster either sort of, you know, assaulting and you know, threatening normality, or normality's attempts to sort of, you know, subdue the monster, but it's a very clear sort of dichotomy between normality and monstrosity. And, you know, to my mind, horror films actually don't work that way at all. That you know, any sense of monstrosity or normality is almost always transformed into its other over the course of the film, not just once or twice, but constantly. You know, horror is about metamorphosis and sort of enacts metamorphosis. And the example from Martin that we've been talking about, I think, is a great sort of illustration of that. You know, that we move from Martin as monster and threat to Martin as, you know, small and vulnerable and estranged and our guide rather than our monster. And the film sort of flips this over and over again and never lets us sort of rest comfortably with the idea of like, well, I know what the monster and monstrosity is, I know what normal and normality is, and therefore I can put myself very comfortably in a place where I feel I belong. And it's much more about like, well, who am I really, and what really is normality, and what is monstrosity, and according to whom, and I think horror is just, that's its DNA. That's what it is always about. You know, and I think, you know, the fact that George Romero could make a film like Martin and clearly see how important it was to make someone like Tony Bubba an essential component of its creation is already a sort of sense that, you know, I'm not making a conventional vampire movie. I mean, I'm making a movie about a place, and who better than Tony to, you know, to make a vampire movie about Braddock. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess then just in transitioning to this final clip, which is from Tony and Ray's, it was Tony Bubba and Ray Henderson's 1996 documentary, Struggles in Steel. I guess like I would frame this as like this film deals with the monstrosity of reality and enacts a sort of, its action is to transform that history. So with that, I guess we can watch this clip.
The black history was entirely ignored. America would not teach black history. It's ashamed of it. It's ashamed of what it's ashamed of what it has done to a people to tell their children and tell the world. It's a shame.
Our kids don't know what kind of progress that we've made over that period of time. They don't associate getting a job in a mill as making progress. They don't associate that with that. You know, they don't realize that we had to fight to go work hard.
By discriminating against us all those years and keeping us out of craft, they hurt the country. Across the nation and all the steel mills where they did just what they did at Bethlehem Steel, Spires Point plant, they hurt America when you do that. Whenever you hurt me, you hurt America. When you hurt me, you can't hurt me if I hurt America.
Until I worked in the mill, you don't have a real conception of what it's like. And no story, no museum, you cannot know what it was like unless you were in there.
When I first went into the steel mill, I heard them talk all the time that the blacks, or the Afro-Americans as we refer to ourselves now, had the dirtiest, the lowest, the filthiest, the man-killing jobs in the mill. They were in the flue holes, they worked the blast furnace, the coke plants, ate up all that smoke and dust.
When I got hired, I went to coke oven. They were building a new coke oven. Then I got vaccinated, my arms swelled this big. So the doctor told me I couldn't do no work. And this foreman I had, he told me, he said, work with one hand. They had the job classified as a black man job and a white man job. They had a labor job picked out for the whites.
Yeah.
You know, the nice job, the clean job. But all the old hard, bogus jobs, they were picked out for blacks.
Did we have black foremen down in here then, at that time, or was just
none at that time?
None at that time.
None at that time.
So we just good enough to pick a shovel and.
That's all.
And not capable of pointing to a guy and saying, "You do this."
Don't teach you nothing. Just work.
Just hard work.
Just hard work.
That's what I did when I started working at the mill. Hard work, just hard work. Growing up in Pittsburgh, steelmaking was in my blood and lungs. After high school and the military, most guys went to work in the mill. I got out of school in 1961, so I joined the Navy and spent time in Southeast Asia. After the Navy, I got a job in Duquesne Steel Mill as a laborer. In 1967, the mills were part of an everyday life. For Afro-Americans, the mills were part of a good life. Sure, the mills were hot and dirty, but they had the best paying jobs a black man could get.
When I went down to Pitt for my junior year in engineering, I went and talked to the dean, and the dean say, "Hey kid, say, what are you in?" And so I said, "Electrical engineering." And he say, "Well, if you get a job, you got to go to South America. If you got an education, then it didn't matter." So I went in the steel mill.
About 10% of the country's steel workers were black, but we never seemed to show up in official history of steel. You would think we never worked in a mill. A documentary aired on a local TV station about steel workers who lost their jobs, and not one black person was in it. For them to say we played no significant role as a steel worker angered me. It hurt my heart because black people helped build this country. I was tired of that talk. So I called my old high school classmate and friend Tony and asked him if we could make our own documentary. Tony said, sure. Now Tony is always being asked by white folks, why do you want to work on a film about black steel workers? Where's the story? The story is we were there, working in the steel mills for generations with other ethnic groups. The story is that we fought and struggled for every single job we got in the mill. The story is the black community was devastated when the mills shut down.
Yeah, so I felt it was important to bring that clip into the room because to not is to reenact what this documentary essentially is made for, and to offer another perspective of like folks dealing with like a real world horror in a real place, not an abstract place, not the idea of a steel mill, not the idea of something, but something that obviously affects people's lives. And I think like, unfortunately, a blind spot in the Romero film is that like we're experiencing like a white view of Braddock predominantly. And yeah, I like just thought that Tony being there and being the connection from Martin to this film is really important because this is like the conversation. What is the conversation that's happening in the community that is experiencing, right, the kind of like the darkest night, the night that jobs are lost, that, you know, your life changes when that check isn't coming in. And I think that this film really does address, unlike the other films, like the real world horror, like, and doesn't abstract it, right? And maybe the way that the Romero film transforms it into a fiction, but it's there. And the Frampton film observes it abstractly, and it lingers in the context of the title and the place where the film is shot, but it's not addressed spot on. And because your book opens with addressing the horror of reality, I just thought it was important to kind of like, yeah, kind of like leave the screening and kind of make space for talking about the horror of the real, which is one of the harder I think horror films make it easy to talk about the horror of the real, but documentaries almost do the opposite. They tell you the horror, and then you're left to kind of cope with it. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, as we're collecting these threads, like, what arises for you?
Yeah, I mean, watching that clip from Struggles in Steel up against the screening of Winter Solstice and the clip from Martin, again, wishing we had more time, another scene I would love to show is there is a scene, I agree with Rebecca that Martin really puts Black experience on the periphery. It's there in pretty interesting ways, actually, but it's on the periphery. There's not like a major Black character in the film. But there is a crucial sequence, which is the glimmer of hope I was talking about, where Martin has a brief moment where he actually joins the community of Braddock briefly. And the way this scene is filmed is a scene that was clearly, a seat of your pants, sort of like, let's film something that's happening rather than like, let's, stage this in a studio. And there's a big parade going on in Braddock, and it's almost entirely African-American people involved in the parade. And Martin sort of hears the rhythm of the music of the band playing and sees the people marching, and he sort of joins them. And it's a real optimistic moment, and it comes right after Martin sort of confesses to this radio host that he's constantly phoning into, that like he realizes that like, he can't count on manipulating people and bending them to his will, even with drugs or even with razor blades, life doesn't work that way, and like he has to find a different way of being. And so what we see in this moment, in this different way of being, is joining the real community of Braddock. And again, it's a passing moment, and there's a tragic end that I won't give away, but you can probably imagine. But I think the presence of that there is interesting, and yeah, and I would add, just as if you're interested in this stuff, just as a footnote, there is a recent horror film, really excellent, underrated horror film called The Transfiguration, that is explicitly indebted to Martin and changes its Martin character into a young African-American boy and plays it out from there, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I agree, and I like that about that scene in the film. I guess I also just wonder, like, I think it's interesting, like, this documentary in particular ends with the community reconciling. Like, there's kind of this depiction of the mills coming down and the community that must, like, reconcile with the reality of something that comes to an end. And yeah, I guess like what I am left wondering with all three of these films, and I hope like we can collectively wonder together, because I don't want to hold people here, but like as a discussion for, as you linger, is like how do we deal with the real horrors of being in cinema in the world, and like what are the ways in which we try to capture that, and how can we bring those conversations to, like, I find that like you rarely see like this kind of cinema put together, but I'm interested in that as a way of kind of like unpacking threads that maybe like not every film can do the whole thing. Like clearly Frampton's film is not trying to do the whole thing, but I think to contextualize it in the reality of its making, maybe isn't what he wanted, but I think does it a different service and like gives it a new context to exist in, that I'm actually really hopeful about and excited about. And so I'm interested in what you all are thinking. And I'm also interested in the fact that like, yeah, I think I mentioned the end of this film to say, like, I think that the film ends in a way that isn't like, again, a horror, like I've just told you this horrific thing, but in the sense that, like, from this horror there is a reconciliation and an acknowledgement that, like, moving on in itself is both a horror and a part of these cycles, in a sense, like that the industry dies and there's a suffering and a communal grieving that is a part of the reality. And I just wanted to, like, kind of bring these things together in how we think about horror in places and hauntings and, yeah, just these things that linger for me, and having seen these three films separately, but an awareness that they are kind of like of an ilk.
Yeah, and I definitely want to turn it over to you guys as quickly as we can. But I wanted to thank you, Rebecca, for giving us an avant-garde film, a horror film, and a documentary film together, and suggesting that a really important way to think about something as big as, well, how does cinema grapple with reality? One answer I think you're suggesting to us in the form of this program is that you need different forms of cinema to do that, and you need them together. You know, you can't say, like, well, it's documentary's responsibility to give us this, or it's the avant-garde film's responsibility to give us this, or the horror film, most people don't think is responsible for anything. I think it's responsible for everything. But, you know, I think bringing these things together and seeing what we can do in the interstices and in the connections between these forms, to me, that's the most hopeful thing, is cinema's ability to inhabit these different forms, and therefore to come at reality from so many different perspectives, and without our needing to say, like, well, we need this one more than this one, or this one has to do this and this one has to do this. I think you've demonstrated for us really beautifully how, you know, it's much more broad and deep than that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I guess I want to open it up for a second if anyone has pressing things they want to say, but I'm going to be around. I think Adam will be around for a few minutes, and maybe in the interest of alleviating folks who maybe are tired or need to go somewhere, we could have a more casual kind of like post-screening discussion, and please, like, remain in discussion. Inbar and I are really hoping that these events can be a way to just, like, ignite a conversation that we all return to. So, yeah, I don't want this to be the end, but rather the invitation itself.
Thank you all.